Welcome to High Growth Matters, a podcast that explores topics on the minds of forward-thinking HR leaders and people managers, from leadership and strategy to emerging technologies. High Growth Matters is sponsored by OpenComp, makers of the world's first compensation software that gives you clarity every time you make a decision about pay. And it's hosted by me, Caitlin Allen, a startup executive with 3 exits under my belt, along with my co-host, Nancy Connery. Nancy was founding VP of HR and employee number 5 at Salesforce, and she now leads one of the most reputable HR advisory firms in Silicon Valley. She's also co-founder of OpenComp. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star rating as we dive in. Today, we are going to answer the question of how you can design an organization that unleashes human potential. And it's not a small one. So we're going to speak with a deep expert in the area whose name is John Foster. He is an executive who has led leadership development, talent, organizational design, and people teams at public companies like Charles Schwab, HP, and IDEO, and then startups like Hulu and TrueCar and TruePill. And today he consults with some of the most disruptive, fast growth companies that we all know about. So John, thank you so much for joining us.
Super glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's going to be so fun. So let's start off with something, a little bit about your background that I might have missed in my intro.
Well, I like to think of my career as like having 3 phases. The first phase was an early part of my life where I did a lot of work in outdoor adventure programming and focused really on leadership development and did a lot of nonprofit work. Then I got through graduate school and started working in the corporate HR domain. Very large companies, a couple you mentioned there, also Fidelity Investments was a big place for me. And then the last phase, I've been working in startups and trying to help build and design and innovate in the way that we operate together at work. And right now it's a very interesting time, where there's lots of good innovation happening.
Yeah, well said. I love the 3 phases. That's a great way of putting it. And that was a professional question, which is important, as is this one, which is more personal. What's something that most of the folks that you work with in your day-to-day don't necessarily know about you?
Yeah, that's a good one. We play the game 2 Truths and a Lie a lot. So if I give you all this information, we're not going to be able to play that game very well anymore. But one thing is that I am actually a carpenter. Early in that first phase, I also worked in home building and actually had a friend from college who started a company. And so one of my first jobs out of school was learning how to be a carpenter and build custom homes. So that I spend free time working with wood and, still building projects and doing stuff like that.
Oh, I love it. That's neat. It's also a good counter, good balance to the time that we all spend thinking about software, things that don't necessarily have like form in a visual way.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I get a lot more done in a 2-hour session with, building like a skateboard ramp or something like that with my son than I would, working for a whole year with a company where you really have no idea if you made an impact.
Well said. Well, talking about impact, let's get into the topic at hand around unleashing human potential. You've coined this term human-centered organization, and I'd love to start off with just basic definitions. Like, what is that, and how is a human-centered organization different than a traditional one?
Okay, well, I think the idea is that most of the companies we work in today, I call those traditional organizations, were designed, hundreds of years ago, maybe not forever ago, but, the corporate monolith, multinational corporate structure really became big in the 20th century as manufacturing became a dominant mode of producing value. And so you think about Henry Ford and GM and General Electric, all those companies built this sort of what I call a traditional organization. And most of them were designed with a mechanistic mindset where people really aren't the center of the purpose of the company. It's more about producing products and being efficient. And so to me, a human-centered organization is one that is thinking about what if we were going to give people the best platform for them to do their best work? What would that look like? How would we build conditions or create conditions where all the traits that make us human are unlocked and they become fully accessible? And that's a little bit of a different premise. So that's what I think a human-centered organization is.
Awesome. And I really think we are in an era where leaders, people leaders, company leaders are really understanding the importance of that kind of focus because of the output that it has for our companies, absolutely, and also just the improvement of the experience along the way too.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about how the assembly line was put together, and this is one of my favorite anecdotes in this research that I've been doing, is the first word a lot of the immigrant laborers learned when they moved into the Detroit area during Henry Ford's first buildup of his assembly line, this River Rouge plant. There was a giant, huge, first of its kind of assembly line. The first word they learned was hurry. So if these are folks coming from Europe, they spoke all these different European languages. The first English term they learned was hurry, because they were doing time motion studies and they were basically operating as robots that we couldn't design yet. And, in today's world with technology available, assembly lines are largely done by machines and you don't have to hurry them up because they're as fast as they can possibly be. And so some of those things don't translate well into creative work where you're building software or you're solving customer problems or you're trying to create something new. That's a little different concept. So we have to really, I think, unpack that and get underneath it to build companies and experiences that will really get human potential to its highest level.
Absolutely. The thought that came to mind when you were telling that story or the anecdote was how traditionally American the word hurry is, to your point. So interested to get into what the contrapositive looks like. You've done a lot of work distilling the essential ingredients. I think there are 4 of them for what it means to build a human-centered organization. What are those?
Yeah, so I'm toying around with the idea of ingredients because of this concept of starting from scratch. I think that when you try to build a tool or a process or a program in today's world, most of us in HR have to borrow from vendors or use best practices that have been promoted by our professional organizations. And when we do that, we're starting with some ingredients that aren't clean. As you think about sort of how we talk about vegan food, or in my own experience recently, my daughter, we discovered is celiac. So we now have to really think about where the food comes from and how it's made. And if it's got gluten in it, it's going to make her sick. So when I think about what would make human-centered organizations work, I think there's this ingredient that we are not paying close attention to. That's paternalism, or it's another word for power. Power and paternalism come from the same root word in the original kind of language of strong man is really what it means in its root form. And so if we have strong men built into everything we do, it's going to be biased and it's going to change the way we interact. So this idea of these 4 ingredients is that if we want to start from scratch and build a process, tool, or program, we might want to be clean about it and make sure we have the right ingredients. So they're culture, leadership, dialogue, and talent. Those are the 4. And I actually think as I've pushed this around some more since we first talked, those are more like compounds in the human body. They're the building blocks of life. Mm-hmm. So the building blocks of organization are these 4 things. And underneath that are even more simple elements like you'd think of in chemistry, like nitrogen and oxygen and carbon. There's things like self-determination theory and whole human development and maturity. And those are things that are almost immutable human laws that just aren't considered when we build most traditional organizations. They don't think about human growth or maturity. Those are all kind of slapped on at the end. They're kind of extras that we add on as benefits versus principles we use to design from scratch.
Interesting. Okay, so culture, leadership, dialogue, and what was the other one?
Talent.
Okay. And I'm trying to make, I think they're pretty self-explanatory. Culture, I imagine, is just like how people act, right? And what beliefs or values they reflect. Leadership is probably related, but it's really what are the people at the top in the positions of power doing. Dialogue is how do people communicate? How does culture basically get put into word form as people are talking together? And then talent is who are you bringing into the organization and cultivating to stay? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think those are accurate summations. And I think the real interesting part is if you break out some of those. I smiled because culture and leadership, so first of all, leadership is for everyone. I don't think it's just people at the top. So we think about that in our paternalistic mindset, which we can't avoid. It's everywhere. It's the water we're in or the air we breathe. So we think naturally, oh yeah, there must be people at the top. And in a start from scratch scenario, we wonder like what it actually is leadership. And I call it a group outcome. It's when multiple players work together to solve a problem and get first. So, to lead is to be in front. And so if you wanted to really get to a pure form of leadership, you would remove hierarchy and executive and position from that discussion. And you talk only about how can we get a group of people to solve a problem together and be first.
Got it.
So that's what I mean by leadership.
Okay. Thank you for that. That nuance is a very important one. Any other, I guess, misconceptions is the word I'm looking for around those 4 topics that we should tease out for the audience that might be different than what they would naturally think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want anybody to feel like there's a right or wrong here. I think this is more about clarification and being precise. I have started this whole thought process now around what is people science. And most of the people science that I've seen is about data and tracking of behaviors and things like that, and then reporting it, which there's nothing wrong with that. But real science has hypotheses and principles and laws that you use to like construct experiments. So I'm trying to use these 4 words as a way to clarify what would it have to be if you were going to run a test or an A/B test and do some science around this? What would it look like? So for me, culture is, I go into all of them in depth. We don't maybe not have time today, but I think all 4 of them need very precise and clear and defensible separate sort of definitions so that you end up with this set of 4 things that actually, if you use all 4 of them, you can build an organization. Now, the organization could be different depending on how you combine them, right. But you think about all 4 as these unique compounds that do different things. Just like in your body, you have fats and carbohydrates and proteins. They're somewhat similar because they have some of the same elements, but they're uniquely built to do something to make the human body work. And that's what I'm trying to get at with these 4 compounds or 4 ingredients for organization design, is that if we use those 4 and use them in a very clear, precise way, we can start to really get some interesting experimentation to happen.
That's really interesting. It's like organizational macros. What percentage do you need of your daily value?
Right on. Yeah.
Interesting. This may be a question that gets into the one I'll ask you after that, which is about the 5 standards of excellence in a human-centered org. But one of the things that I feel like I've noticed, and I'm, a data point of 1, but is the fact that oftentimes companies put in their values actually something that they really struggle with behaving on or acting on. Like you often see, and I'm just making up a random example, but let's say that a company says that it really cares about diversity of thought. That often tends to be something that organization really struggles with. Is that something you've noticed at all across the board, or maybe unique or to my experience? And if it is, like, any antidotes?
Yeah, this is an area that I've spent a lot of time on in my career because I worked in culture change and, org development, where values and culture are kind of part of the main purpose of the job. And along the way, I ran into the work of Charles O'Reilly from Stanford and Berkeley. And he did some really interesting research to develop insights into what values exist in organizations. And despite all of the different value statements and mission statements that you've probably seen in your life and everybody's seen, he was able to, and it's a whole team of people, were able to discover 7 unique values, I guess the best word. And each company, so sometimes companies will have 10, sometimes they'll have 3. And what they found in their meta research was that there's only 7 that are either, they call mutually exclusive, but also not missing. And so that's an interesting thing, because then you can say, okay, it doesn't matter what we call them, but there are 7 different ways we can align our behavior around something aspirational. And if diversity is one of them, I'm not sure if that's actually one that would be in his, I think it's something like, I don't remember right now. I'd have to pull up the research to find out what he called the 7. But I think there are a lot of aspirational statements where people are trying to say, we want to be like this. I think the infamous Netflix deck that came out in the mid 2000s was largely aspirational. Great work. I loved it. It was very inspirational to see. But if you asked people at the time that worked there, is all this true? I think they'd say it's a gap. And so part of the reason you make those statements, I think, is to set that gap so that you can have tension and you can build yourself towards that aspiration. And I think the tricky part is not to pick too many. The research of most of the high performing culture work is really strong cultures are aligned around one or two. And there's clear, commitment between individual behavior and organizational kind of verbiage and sort of aspirations, that those are the two that make us special. And it's not a broad-based, diluted, everybody loves everything.
That makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you taking me down my rabbit hole, but I'm really glad we did.
It's a good rabbit hole. It's long.
It's important. And I think that the point that's sticking out to me a lot is the word tension that you brought up. That is how muscles are built. And so to have that gap, to have the tension is a good bar to have. The other point that stood out to me a lot is the one or two, right? Like, I don't know that there are many organizations out there that just have one or two.
Yeah. That's also the first diagnostic when I'm looking at companies. They have, spent a lot of time on their websites to present this beautiful sort of manifesto. And if you can't discern one in there or two, then I usually say, hey, let's talk about what does it mean to work here? And that helps them start. And oftentimes there is one. It's just they've thrown the other ones in because they feel like they're missing if they don't put them in there.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, great. Well, getting back to the standards of excellence for human-centered organizations, I think you have 5 of them. Could you walk us through those as well?
Yeah, so this is more like not values as much as based on what we know about human behavior, what are the things necessary to help them perform at their best? So, and I would say apply this to any organization. And I've built sort of a survey to help people kind of play with this. There's about 50 questions. And what it basically is at the base level, and I think this is more like a spider chart. I've been working on this for a couple of years, and I keep playing different ways to present it. I don't think it's a hierarchy. I don't think at one point I thought it was maybe like an equalizer, like in the Risky Business movie where he's got the whole equalizer and he changes all the sound. But now I'm starting to think of it more as a spider chart. So I think you need all 5 in some amount of zero, more than 0. Some organizations are stronger in some of these 5 than others, and probably few of them are, probably fully articulated in all 5. So it creates that tension for you in a way that's not about values. It's about measuring evidence-based behavior or using evidence to, measure behavior. So one of them is safety. People can't function well if they're unsafe. And that's well established by Amy Edmondson with her psychological safety work, but it's true even in traditional HR and laws. We have discrimination laws, we have violence laws, we have buildings with, metal detectors, and there are conditions we're creating so people will feel safe and all forms of safety. Most companies address that, and they kind of have to, or they're out of line with law. Compliance kind of fits in there as well, but it's mostly about safety. The second one I would call productivity. And I think most organizations are interested in trying to make things somewhat efficient and somewhat effective, better or worse, and over time in different sizes of organizations, this can be all sorts of different types of things, from tools and information to the way we organize to what cities we pick to live in, all that kind of stuff. The next one would be engagement. And I mean that along the lines of how Gallup presented engagement as really it's about feeling aligned with your work and getting feedback and feeling like you have a developmental opportunity. So it's higher order than productivity. It's more about me and my personal growth. Then sustainability is one that's really becoming popular now as we start to think about not only sustainability of the company and its ecosystem, but the sustainability of the workday. Can I do this same job this way every day? All the work from home stuff, the hybrid, should I travel and commute? Do I burn out? Is this going to be a job I can handle as a parent? That kind of stuff to me is about sustainability. And then the last one is transcendence. And that's the purpose stuff where people are working for their job and they're doing their work and they have a transactional component, but they also feel like they're doing something that's impacting the world in a way that's bigger than an exchange of money for goods. Like they're somehow having a positive effect on society or the planet.
I love it. I feel like you just basically created a corporate Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people want to put it in that order, and I say it in that order, But as I start to think about implementing it, I don't think you wait until the end. Like transcendent companies start being transcendent pretty early. Like Cotopaxi is an example. Like that company has from the beginning said, we're going to do things differently in our supply chain, and we're going to build products that are not going to use, petrochemicals and Patagonia is kind of in that camp too.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have to wait hierarchically. I think you just do have to think about all five simultaneously.
I love it. How do you work with companies to develop a scorecard along those five categories? Because measuring progress towards them is probably very important since it's likely a long-term process.
It's definitely a long-term, and I'm not sure I've had the chance to do the whole thing in my career yet, because I've only worked at companies 3 or 4 years for the most part. So it's actually would love to have a chance. That's partially why I'm trying to present this work is if we could get a community of practice around this and have a lot of people working on this framework together, we could probably build an open source project around org effectiveness that I think would be really cool. So that's kind of my secret mission here. But, I have a survey that I use and recently formalized it into like a Google survey. So it's not fancy, but historically I've done it as a diagnostic. When I show up as a new chief people officer, I have just a series of questions I ask that cover the bases. And I have a what do they call it? The Eisenhower matrix of urgent and important. And I kind of go through that and just look for and observe and discover what the company's doing and try to find a way to put a benchmark down for each of those areas. It's pretty recent that I formalized it into this sort of 5 buckets.
Love that. That's great. I really like the idea too of the community sourced project, because you're right. These are very long-term things that involve many, many data points to make an aggregate analysis, so to speak. Then maybe asking the question in perhaps a somewhat different way. If you could wave a magic wand and that stopped companies from doing something that you see companies doing a lot, maybe it's paternalism, maybe it's something different, what would that one thing be?
Well, I think I'll be really, I don't know what the right word is, present with today and just say layoffs. I think paternalism is more complicated. We can talk about that more in a second. It's hard to just stop being paternalistic. I'm not sure it's even necessary unless you're allergic to power, which I don't think we are. You don't need to take it completely out, but pay attention to it. But layoffs to me are a concrete example of where the company is not really thinking about the human impact. They're thinking about finance. They're thinking about marketing. They're thinking about customers. And those are obviously, this is a business environment, so we want to be successful that way. But I'm particularly interested in what's going on at Salesforce right now, because it seems to be causing a big dust up that they're doing this. And we're talking tens of thousands of people in a company that's making billions and billions of dollars. Amazon does the same thing where they lay off people and they've got all sorts of money in the bank. They're not a startup that's trying to just raise money. So I'm disturbed by that, and I'm not sure exactly why or what to do about it. But I would think if we could just say there's no layoffs, maybe that would force us into some other types of decision-making that would be better for everyone and still produce. I think I'm not talking about making companies go bankrupt. I don't think they should do that, but that's the one thing.
That makes a lot of sense. And thank you. It's very timely. I feel like I actually read a Fortune CHRO newsletter this morning with several of those names in it on the theme of layoffs. Maybe just diving into that answer a bit from your very expert perspective, what's at the core of layoffs that are too common, whatever word you want to put on it, but is it bad comp planning? Is it us treating economic downturns as ways to kind of like clear the house, so to speak? Is there something else? And not to point fingers to any one of the companies you mentioned by any means. I'm asking the question quite generally.
Well, I imagine it's probably not as simple as one thing. It's probably those things you mentioned make sense to me. I think when you're not doing a good job of human capital management, which a lot of that is compensation planning and understanding, you should, I think, ideally have a very good, solid understanding of your current costs and your planned and future costs and be able to model that and see how that aligns with your business. That's kind of one of the very first things I do in HR is try to say, okay, what's our capital expenditure and what's our ROI on that? And if we don't do it that way, we're not really being business-like. We're just filling jobs. And a lot of companies I've been around have allowed their organization growth to come simply because businesses say, I need more people. And they don't necessarily go through the trade-off of what about short-term versus long-term? What are the costs? What are the values and all that? So the business case problem, I think, is underlying that. The most successful companies I worked with, I had a great partnership with the CFO. And before a headcount was ever opened, we understood like the investment and the return on investment sort of thesis. And I think that's what, maybe lately a lot's happening now because there was a run on talent. There was this weird feeling of I don't like the whole concept of a war on talent, by the way. I don't think there is a scarcity of talent out there. So you shouldn't have to go after people and pay them too much to get them to come on board. Last company I just worked with hired something like 750 people maybe it was more like 1,000 people in a 2-quarter span. And in the next 2 quarters laid them all off again. To me, that's just poor planning. And it was probably the result of really free money. Like the investment world was giving hundreds of millions of dollars to companies to grow fast. And, it was called growth at all costs. And that's a big cost. So I don't know, there's a couple of different themes in there, but
yep, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a ton of sense. And I do think how we behave ideally could be more consistent in times of growth at all costs and in times of conserve cash at all costs, because give it 6 months and we'll probably be in the other phase.
Right. For sure. And it's, so we've had this whipsaw thing going on for a little while now. Hopefully we can migrate out of that and get to a little bit, there should be waves. I'm sure there will be, but it seems like the extremes have caused a lot of trouble the last few years. Yep.
I want to click into paternalism really quickly because your comment was really intriguing to me around like, you don't necessarily need to get rid of paternalism. We're not necessarily allergic to power as humans. So like, what are the ways to think about paternalism and transforming it into a human-centered era?
Well, I think it starts first with just being conscious of it and being precise about what you're trying to build. And so my thinking has been that if our organization design is largely just a lack of consciousness, this is how everybody does it, so I'll just keep doing it. And so we import all this stuff. And I think it's very similar to the way corporate food has become unhealthy for at least Americans, probably most people on the planet. We eat a lot of processed foods without really thinking about it because it was really convenient, it's cheap, and there's a lot of benefits to that. But as you look at the buildup over time, you start to go, wow, maybe we should be a little more conscious of our eating and know where our food comes from. So I feel it's the same thing with paternalism are we setting up power structures? I see people positioning for win-lose all the time. I just saw something on LinkedIn where somebody was talking about her job was that she was a professional negotiator. And she was her post was basically saying, I'll never say I'm sorry at the beginning of a sentence and she was positioning it around women and how they always apologize. And so on one level, I agree, women shouldn't be apologizing because there's no need to apologize for your presence. And there might be a bias there that they're trying to work on. On the other side, I'm thinking, but between two reciprocal parties that are equal, it's nice to be able to say to a person, here's some thoughts I have. They're just my thoughts. What are your thoughts? And then you get together and discuss. So I think therein lies the real issue with paternalism. If somebody's trying to position to win and be dominant, then they're not getting, the economics would say they're not getting full value out of it. Game theory says win-win will always produce more value than win-lose. And there's a ton of economic theory around this, but we're not practicing it in our corporate behavior. So I think we need to get more conscious of the economic benefits of reciprocity and the economic downsides of paternalism.
Really well said. And it's actually reminding me a bit of what you had said earlier on in this episode about how leadership is a flat thing, how it's, we're all leaders of ourselves, we're all leaders of others in our interactions with them. So it's taking that, the initiative ourselves, it's giving value in ways that we would want to receive it, is kind of the theme that I'm hearing.
Yeah. And being able to be in that. So part of where my work goes back to my roots is mature adults. To be a mature adult in any moment is challenging. for me, for everybody, like we have all of our normal human traits that cause us to make mistakes and be selfish or whatever. But I really like Robert Keegan's work around adult maturity and how over time you can develop yourself to be in a place where you're more able to see the situation instead of be in it. And the Conscious Leadership Group has really good practical work on this with the above the line, below the line model they have. So I think if people can invest in being above the line, they're going to be creative, and then they're going to create reciprocal agreements that can lead to, win-win, high value outcomes. And that's the nut of the work in the bottom.
I love it. So rounding out the discussion a bit here, John, what are some of the most innovative things that you've seen organizations do recently, whether you've been working with them or just reading or observing about them?
Most of my attention right now is the companies that are embracing flexibility and trying to figure out how to create conditions in this post-COVID tech-enabled environment. How do you turn those into? So this is a great example of starting from scratch. They're moving out of just replicating old office behavior on Zoom and into recreating a work experience that capitalizes on the technology and embraces the idea that, people might want to work different hours or have some control over their schedule. There are some extreme examples we saw with what company is it that just outlawed, I think it was Shopify, just outlawed meetings. They just, cleaned the slate. And I've considered doing that in other companies. I'm sure they're going to have to build some meetings back in, but it's almost easier to say, you know what, prove that this meeting needs to happen versus let's decide if we want to keep it, and the momentum shift. So I thought that was really provocative. I don't think it'll stand that they have no meetings, but I like that. I thought that was interesting.
It's a really good point. I'm someone who absolutely loves the flexibility trend you're bringing up. I'm a morning person, so I get up at 5 every morning. I love starting work at 7 o'clock. And what that has often meant is I've started work at 7 o'clock and then I go until 5 or 6, and then don't have enough balance in my life. So the ability to turn off, a little bit earlier and then maybe get back on later, like I'm actually more productive because I miss the afternoon slump that, where I'm not really fun to be around or productive. And similarly on my team, this is the third time I've managed a team that is in all time zones of the US. Mm-hmm. And so our rule is kind of loosely held is probably the best way to talk about the rule. But we ask people try to be in seat between the hours of 9 and 2 Pacific, because those are the 5 we all have in common. And it works wonderfully well. We've gone through the phases you're talking about too, where we've canceled meetings, we've put some back on, we've canceled all of them. So that we don't have to prove that they need to exist, but actually just start new ones. And it's been neat to see the habit of huddles, for instance, really crop up on our team, where people will pop on for a 5-minute quick chat during a no meeting day. And are infinitely more productive because that 15-minute or 30-minute calendar block isn't there. And it can happen a little bit more organically.
Well, and then if you dig into that's great to hear. I think you touch on a couple of things that I think are really critical. One is access to talent is more fluid, and that gives you more opportunities to live a better lifestyle and get away from these sort of high cost of living hubs that I do believe people want to get in touch and talk to each other and be live sometimes. So there's that, but there's access for women and parents, and particularly moms, to be able to have a better day and still be highly productive and balance things a little differently. There's access for folks that traditionally haven't been able to move and relocate to a new environment. So that opens the door, and all sorts of diversity kind of elements, and underrepresented groups have access to jobs they may not have had before, so there's all that. But then there's within the meetings themselves, what's happening is the really good companies are starting to think talking in a circle is biased in so many ways and unproductive. So it's not just meetings, it's how we meet. Mm-hmm. And so another really innovative thing I've seen recently is this company Balloon that I mentioned in our email exchange. There's different learning styles. You need to write things down. IDEO is great at this with their brainstorming rules. If you want a bunch of ideas, have everybody write them down separately first, then share them. Share them on a wall so everybody can see them at the same time and have time to look at them and absorb them. And so the way everybody works is changing if we can facilitate meetings and make the interaction just not one person talking and presenting with a PowerPoint slide. That's only one way to interact.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's reminding me of something that a mentor once told me, which I've tried to use too since then, which is when you do go around the room and kind of each share opinions out loud, to start with the most junior person and then go all the way up the chain, so to speak, to the most senior. It's a great way of making sure that they don't replicate ideas that have already been said. And you also get just such good ideas because people are kind of they're the rubber hitting the road in ways that leaders aren't. So I appreciate you sharing those. Those are great. Second to last question, and it's somewhat of an abstract one, so take it where you'd like, but what, from your perspective, does the future of human potential in the workplace look like?
I'll share a conversation I just had around our kitchen island with my daughter who's in college, and Chat CPT. Is that what it is? I didn't even say I can say it right. I've never heard anybody actually say it out loud. But the idea that AI can create a term paper hit the planet last semester. And it's all over LinkedIn where people are doing poems and other types of specs like product specs. And I saw somebody do a hydration pack for backpacking. And so AI can now create what used to be a low level type of learning, which is go search the internet, find 5 sources, find the salient facts, recognize the pattern, and reproduce it into a summary form that represents, some insight or truth about that stuff you found. That's synthesis and presentation. And I think that computers can do that. That's one of the hardest things for people to do. First of all, it's really hard. At IDEO, when we worked there, brainstorming is one thing, but then finding the pattern and translate that into an insight is really challenging. So I think human potential is there. It's where we're creating and we're using these. So instead of spending all our horsepower on the research and the pattern recognition, AI can present us with 5 patterns. And then we can say, okay, what do we want to do with these, and become more creative and spend our time doing the things computers can't do. So I think if we're going to tap into that, we have to embrace the technology and figure out how to blend it in. So like back to the school thing we were talking about. So is the point of the term paper to get a grade, or is it to learn? And I don't know if everybody's aligned on that. You want to get a good grade so you can get to the next level. If you have a great GPA, you're going to get into good college. If you have a great GPA, you get into grad school, whatever. So why not use AI to get a great grade? But then you're just bypassing the whole learning process. So I think we really need to think about how technology is going to be leveraged inside of companies, and our org design is going to need to change in order to support that and to give people more freedom and more coaching and development in how to be creative. Because a lot of entry-level jobs aren't creative jobs. They're repetitive, they're research-based, and I think we have to do some work there. It's going to be interesting. We're touching it.
Really well said. Well, John, thank you. This has been so enjoyable, and we ask our guests the same question at the very end. Of all of the really nuanced and insightful things you've shared with us today, if our listeners acted on one of the things that you have said and you could design it, what would it be?
I guess I would say have everybody start to tally, just one of those like notice this things where you just tally all day long, how many times the word power comes up, or you notice a paternalistic encounter where someone might be beneficially trying to help you, but you're sort of like, I got this. You don't need to tell me what to do. So micromanaging, over-instructing, taking care of my people would be an example of a paternalistic statement. Sounds good. You're really nice to take care of us, but why are you taking care of me? Like, we're working together. So I would say tally the amount of paternalism you notice in a week and send me a note. I'd love to see what people hear. Maybe just throw up something on LinkedIn, or it'd be really funny to see how often people encounter it.
Love that. Let's do it. That sounds fabulous. And we'll include John's LinkedIn profile in the show notes so that you can share with him your observations. To the listeners, don't forget to give us a 5-star rating if you feel that it's appropriate. And if you have ideas for topics or guests, you can email me at podcast@opencomp.com. And otherwise, John, thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
My pleasure. Thanks for a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Really fun.
Win top talent while strengthening runway with OpenComp. Thousands of the world's fastest growing companies use our compensation intelligence platform because it offers the most competitive benchmarks and insights available. To learn more, visit app.opencomp.com/signup.